Stephen lugged his suitcase down the narrow hallway, his sneakers scuffing against the polished floor. The faint hum of the artificial lighting overhead mingled with the low chatter of students moving in. This was supposed to be exciting, he reminded himself, a new chapter, a chance to meet people from far corners of Earth and beyond. Instead, his stomach churned with anxiety. Sharing a room with someone, let alone someone not human, wasn't exactly his comfort zone. He reached the door marked 314 and hesitated, adjusting the strap of his bag. "This is fine," he muttered under his breath, as if saying it aloud would make it true. With a deep breath, he swiped his access card, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. The sight that greeted him was breathtaking. Alira stood by the wide window that overlooked the campus gardens. Her figure was lit by the golden glow of the setting sun, but it was her presence that stunned him. She looked almost human, but not quite. Her skin shimmered faintly, as though the light wasn't just reflecting off her, but emanating from within. Patterns of soft bioluminescent light danced across her arms and neck, like constellations coming to life, their colors shifting slowly from blue to silver to a faint lavender. Her features were delicate, ethereal eyes large and luminous, with irises that seemed to hold galaxies within them. Stephen froze mid-step, suddenly hyper-aware of the scuff on his sneakers, the wrinkles in his hoodie, the sheer mundanity of himself in comparison. She turned, her movements impossibly graceful, and fixed her gaze on him. For a second he thought she might be annoyed by his intrusion, but her expression was unreadable, her head tilting slightly as if studying him. The glowing patterns on her skin brightened briefly, then settled into a warm, pulsing amber. "You must be Stephen," she said, her voice like a song woven from silk. "Welcome." Her tone was polite, if a little distant, but there was no mistaking the curiosity in her eyes. Stephen fumbled for words. Yeah, that's me, Stephen." "Hi." She stepped forward and Stephen instinctively took a step back. She stopped, a flicker of something confusion, maybe passing over her face. The glowing patterns on her arms rippled, shifting into a soft blue. "You are uneasy," she observed, her words more a statement than a question. "Have I done something to offend?" No, not at all," Stephen said quickly, heat rising to his cheeks. "I'm just getting used to everything." He gestured vaguely around the room, though he really meant you. Alira regarded him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Of course. Adjustment is natural." She turned back to the window, the conversation seemingly over, but Stephen couldn't help but notice how her glowing patterns now flickered faintly, as though dimmed by disappointment. The next few days were an awkward dance of avoidance and misunderstanding. Alira was, by all accounts, the perfect roommate. She kept her side of the room immaculate, her belongings arranged with almost ceremonial precision. Yet, her habits unnerved Stephen. She often moved silently, appearing in the kitchen or by the door without warning. Sometimes she would stand a little too close when she spoke to him, her large eyes studying his face with unnerving intensity. Worse still was her fondness for touch. To Stephen she seemed oblivious to the concept of personal space. A casual brush of her hand on his arm as she passed, a light touch on his shoulder when she called his name. Each gesture left him flustered, his heart racing. He tried to explain, fumbling through the words, but she only tilted her head, puzzled. "On Ilvar," she explained one evening, "touch is a bond of trust, of connection. It is how we share our presence with one another." She smiled faintly, though the glowing patterns on her skin shifted to a muted silver. "You earthlings are solitary creatures." Stephen wasn't sure if it was a statement or a gentle jab. Either way, it left him feeling awkward, caught between guilt and frustration. One night, unable to sleep, Stephen found himself staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of Alira's bioluminescence glowing softly through the divider curtain. He wondered what she thought of him, her quiet, withdrawn roommate who flinched at every gesture of kindness. Did she regret being paired with him? Did she find him strange? The next morning, as they passed each other in the small kitchen, she paused. "You do not need to apologize for your ways," she said, her tone calm but laced with something softer. Her glowing patterns pulsed faintly. "It is different, but I do not mind." Her words lingered with him all day. She had been patient, kind even despite his awkwardness. He couldn't help but feel that he owed her some kind of effort in return. By the end of the week, Stephen decided he needed to try harder. He brought back a box of Ilvarian fruit he'd found in the campus market, their translucent skins shimmering faintly under the dormitory lights. Alira's glowing patterns brightened when she saw them, her eyes widening in what Stephen guessed was delight. "You brought these for me?" she asked, her voice lilting with surprise. He shrugged, suddenly shy. "I figured you might miss home, or something." Her smile was small but genuine, and for the first time Stephen felt like he'd done something right. As she reached for the fruit, her fingers brushed his hand and her bioluminescence flared briefly gold and warm. It was fleeting, but it left Stephen feeling something he couldn't quite name. The divide between them was still there, but it felt a little smaller now. Maybe, he thought, this wouldn't be so bad after all. The dormitory was quiet, the usual hum of voices and footsteps reduced to the occasional murmur from a neighboring room. Stephen hurried down the hallway, clutching his notebook tightly. His midterm presentation was the next day, and he had left his most important notes on his desk, an oversight that felt monumental in the moment. He needed those notes now, or he wouldn't get any sleep. The door to their shared dorm room slid open with a faint hiss, and Stephen rushed inside without a second thought. His mind was so preoccupied that he didn't notice anything unusual at first. A soft gasp made him freeze. Stephen turned his head and felt his breath catch in his throat. Alira stood by her bed, half-dressed, her shimmering fabric draped loosely over her shoulders. The translucent material seemed to glow faintly, catching the light from her bioluminescent patterns. The intricate designs on her skin pulsed with soft lavender and gold, swirling in slow, hypnotic waves. He could see the surprise in her wide eyes, but she didn't scream or react as he'd expected. Instead, she simply stood there, her gaze steady, her head tilting ever so slightly. Stephen's mind raced, every cell in his body screaming at him to turn around, to leave, to do something other than stand there like an idiot. Sorry, he stammered, his voice cracking. His face burned with embarrassment as he spun around, ready to bolt out of the room. Wait, Alira said, her voice calm yet firm. It wasn't a request, it was a statement. A single word that rooted him to the spot. He hesitated, his hand hovering near the door panel. I did not say you had to leave, she continued, her tone measured but curious. You have seen. It is no concern. Stephen blinked, his heart pounding. No concern. I have barged in. I didn't mean to. It happens, she said simply, as if that explained everything. He heard the rustle of fabric behind him, and his shoulders tensed. Was she still? You seem unsettled, she observed, her voice tinged with what sounded like amusement. But since you are here, would you assist me? Stephen turned halfway, his confusion outweighing his embarrassment. Assist you? He echoed, incredulous. Yes, she gestured to the delicate fabric hanging loosely over her form, its shimmering surface catching the faint light of her bioluminescent patterns. This garment has intricate fastenings, and I require assistance to secure it. His jaw dropped. You? Want me to help you get dressed? She tilted her head, her luminous eyes blinking slowly. Yes, it is customary in Ilvarian culture for companions to assist one another in such matters. It is a gesture of trust. Stephen felt as though his brain had short-circuited. I don't think humans really do that. Alira stepped closer, her bioluminescent patterns shifting into shades of soft blue and green, the colors pulsing faintly. Humans and Ilvarians are not so different, she said, her voice quiet but steady. You are nervous, but I trust you. Should I not? Her words sent a strange pang through his chest. She spoke with such sincerity, her gaze unwavering. It wasn't a command, or even a plea, just a calm assertion that left him feeling both honored and utterly out of his depth. Aye, okay, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Stephen's hands hovered uncertainly as Alira explained the fastenings. Her voice was patient as she described the delicate loops and clasps, each one seemingly designed to confound human hands. She stepped closer, guiding his hands gently to the fabric, her elongated fingers brushing against his. The touch sent a jolt through him, her skin impossibly soft and warm. Her bioluminescent patterns flared briefly, casting a soft golden glow across her collarbone. Your hands are trembling, she observed, glancing up at him. Her tone wasn't mocking, it was almost curious. I'm not used to this, Stephen admitted, his cheeks burning. He focused intently on the clasp in front of him, trying not to notice the way her skin shimmered faintly under the fabric. It's kind of a lot. Her gaze softened and her glowing patterns shifted to a calming lavender. It is only fabric, Stephen, she said, a faint smile playing at her lips. And trust. Somehow her words steadied him. He fumbled through the first few fastenings, but as he worked, his movements grew more confident. Alira continued to explain the cultural significance of the garment, its color, its design, the way the patterns mirrored her bioluminescence. Her voice was calm and melodic, grounding him even as the intimacy of the moment left him breathless. As his fingers brushed against her skin again, her patterns flared once more, glowing a soft amber. He paused, pulling his hands back instinctively. Sorry, did I hurt you? Alira blinked, then shook her head. No, that is an Ilvarian response to touch. Her gaze met his, her expression unreadable. It means I feel your presence. Stephen swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Her words felt both matter-of-fact and deeply profound, leaving him with a strange sense of vulnerability he couldn't quite explain. When the final clasp was secured, Aelira stepped back, the shimmering garment now draped elegantly over her form. She looked at him, her glowing patterns shifting into a warm golden hue. "You did well," she said softly, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Thank you." Stephen rubbed the back of his neck, feeling both relieved and strangely reluctant to leave the moment behind. Yeah, sure, no problem." Their gazes lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and Stephen felt a quiet tension settle between them, an unspoken question, a fragile connection. Before he could say anything else, Aelira turned toward the window, her glowing patterns dimming slightly as if signaling the end of the exchange. Stephen stepped back, his heart still racing as he left the room. As the door closed behind him, he leaned against the wall, exhaling a shaky breath. For the first time, he realized that his unease around Aelira wasn't just about their differences. It was about the intensity of their connection, the strange, magnetic pull that seemed to grow stronger with every interaction. And he wasn't sure if he was ready to face what that meant. Stephen sat at the small desk in their shared dorm room, his notebook open but his pen idle in his hand. The hum of the campus outside had quieted with the approach of evening, leaving only the soft whir of the climate controls and the faint sound of Aelira's movements on the other side of the room divider. He had spent the last few days trying to process the strange and disarmingly intimate moment they had shared, but his thoughts always seemed to circle back to one question: what did it mean to her? He was no stranger to cultural differences, but the intensity of Ilvarian touch and trust had left him reeling. Stephen had always thought of physical contact as something reserved for the closest of relationships, family, partners, maybe friends in the right context. But to Aelira, it seemed so natural, so fundamental. That was what unnerved him most of all, how easily she had invited him into that space, her calm trust so unshaken. "You are thinking again." Her voice broke through his reverie, melodic and soft. He turned to see her standing at the edge of the room divider, her glowing patterns a subdued lavender, as if reflecting her calm curiosity. She held a small wooden box, its edges intricately carved with swirling designs that seemed to echo the patterns on her skin. Yeah, just studying," Stephen replied, though he knew she could see the untouched notebook in front of him. Aelira's lips curved into a faint smile. "You are terrible at lying," she said lightly, stepping closer. "I brought something. Would you like to see?" Stephen hesitated but nodded. "Sure." She knelt gracefully on the floor and opened the box, revealing spools of thread that shimmered like liquid starlight. Their colors shifted as they caught the light, from deep indigo to pale gold to a vibrant teal. Alongside the threads were tiny, delicate tools, needles, clasps, and something that looked like a miniature loom. Stephen leaned closer, fascinated despite himself. "This is Ilvarian star waving," Aelira explained, her voice soft with reverence. "An art form taught from a young age. We use these threads to create patterns that reflect the energy of the maker and the bonds they share." Stephen frowned slightly. "Bonds? Like connections with other people?" She nodded, her glowing patterns brightening briefly with approval. "Exactly. Every thread carries a part of the weaver's essence, their emotions, their intentions. To weave with another is to share that connection. It is intimate." The word hung in the air between them, charged and weighty. Stephen shifted uncomfortably, but Aelira's gaze remained steady, her expression open. "Would you like to try?" she asked, her bioluminescent patterns shifting into a soft blue-green that he had come to recognize as hope. Stephen hesitated. "I don't know, I've never done anything like this before." Aelira smiled faintly. "That is why I will guide you. Come." Stephen found himself sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her, the small loom balanced between them. Aelira's fingers moved with practiced grace as she demonstrated the process, threading the shimmering fibers through the loom with delicate precision. Her glowing patterns flared subtly with each movement, as if responding to the act of creation itself. "Here," she said, guiding his hand to the loom. Her touch was light but deliberate, her elongated fingers brushing against his as she adjusted his grip. Stephen felt a strange warmth spread through him at the contact, a mixture of nervousness and something deeper that he couldn't quite name. Aelira leaned closer, her presence both soothing and electric. "Begin here," she instructed, her voice low. "The thread must pass through this loop, then over. Like this." Stephen mimicked her movements, his hands clumsy compared to her fluid precision. She chuckled softly, the sound warm and unguarded. "You are too tense," she said, her glowing pattern shifting to a faint gold. "Relax." "Easy for you to say," Stephen muttered, but he couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. Alira reached out, her hand resting lightly on his wrist. The touch was simple, yet it sent a jolt through him, her bioluminescent patterns flaring briefly with a soft amber light. "Stephen," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You cannot create something beautiful if you are afraid to touch it." Her words lingered in the air, their meaning deeper than the simple act of weaving. Stephen swallowed hard and nodded, forcing himself to focus on the loom. Slowly, with Alira's guidance, he began to find a rhythm. The thread shimmered under his fingers, its shifting colors almost hypnotic. He didn't notice how close she had moved until her shoulder brushed against his, the warmth of her presence grounding him. As the minutes stretched into an hour, Stephen felt the tension in his body ease. The act of weaving, once daunting, became almost meditative. Alira's voice was a constant presence, her instructions blending with soft encouragement. Occasionally her fingers would graze his as she adjusted the threads, each touch sparking a brief flare of light from her glowing patterns. When they finished, Alira held up the small piece of fabric they had created. It was uneven and clumsy in places, but the colors swirled together in a way that was undeniably beautiful. "You have done well," she said, her glowing pattern shifting into a warm gold. Stephen laughed softly. "Pretty sure you did most of the work?" She tilted her head, her luminous eyes meeting his. "That is not true. This is ours. Together." The quiet intensity of her words sent a shiver through him. He looked down at the woven fabric, the intermingling threads a tangible reminder of the moment they had shared. For a fleeting second he wondered if she felt the same strange pull, that he did, a connection that defied logic but felt undeniable. As if sensing his thoughts, Alira reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against the back of his hand. Her touch was warm, her bioluminescence flaring softly. "You understand now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To create, to touch, is to share a part of yourself." Stephen met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. "I think I'm starting to." Their eyes lingered, the space between them heavy with unspoken possibilities. In that moment, Stephen realized that the boundaries he had once clung to so tightly were beginning to dissolve, replaced by something far more luminous and profound. Stephen sat at the dorm room's small kitchen table, staring at his untouched cup of tea. It had gone cold long ago, but he hardly noticed. His mind was elsewhere, circling back, as it often did, to Alira. Their shared dorm arrangement had been anything but ordinary from the start. But now, after the strange intimacy of helping her dress, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them. He thought back to the glow of her bioluminescent patterns as they had flared under his touch, the warmth of her trust in him, the way her words seemed to linger even after she had left the room. It wasn't just her otherworldly beauty or the differences in their cultures, it was the connection she offered so freely. The weight of her calm, patient presence. A part of him was still reeling from it all. "Stephen." Her voice startled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Alira standing by the doorway, her glowing patterns soft and steady, the color of faint lavender that radiated calm. She held a small, ornate box in her hands, its surface engraved with flowing, interlocking designs that shimmered faintly in the light. "I have something to share with you," she said, her tone gentle yet inviting, "if you are willing." Stephen blinked, caught off guard by her sudden invitation. Yeah, sure," he said, pushing his chair back and standing awkwardly. "What is it?" Alira crossed the room with her usual quiet grace, her luminous eyes fixed on his. She set the box on the table and opened it, revealing a collection of shimmering threads and tiny, intricate tools. The threads seemed to glow faintly, their colors shifting from silver to deep blue to gold, depending on how the light touched them. Stephen leaned closer, captivated by their ethereal beauty. "This is Ilvarian star weaving," Alira explained, her voice tinged with reverence. "It is an art form deeply rooted in our culture. Through weaving we express connection, intention, and emotion. Each thread is a part of the weaver, a reflection of their energy." Stephen glanced up at her, his brow furrowed. "You mean, it's like expressing your self?" "More than that," she said, her gaze steady. "It is a way of sharing. To weave with another is an act of trust, a merging of energies. It is intimate." The last word hung in the air between them, charged and unspoken. Stephen swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Alira tilted her head slightly, studying his expression. Her bioluminescent patterns flickered, the lavender hue deepening into a warm gold. "Would you like to try?" she asked. Stephen hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I don't know if I'd be any good at it." Alira's lips curved into a faint smile. "That does not matter. What matters is the connection." She gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Come." Stephen found himself sitting next to her, the small loom balanced on the table between them. Alira began by threading the loom, her elongated fingers moving with practiced precision. The shimmering threads caught the light as they slid through her hands, forming intricate patterns that seemed to ripple with life. "Here," she said, guiding his hand to the loom. Her touch was light but deliberate, her skin warm against his. Stephen felt a jolt of nervousness, his chest tightening as he glanced at her. Alira's expression remained calm, her glowing patterns steady. "Follow my movements?" He tried to mimic her, but his hands felt clumsy compared to her graceful precision. Alira chuckled softly, the sound light and melodic. "You are overthinking it," she said. "Relax, let the thread guide you." Stephen exhaled slowly and tried again, focusing on the feel of the thread between his fingers. Alira leaned closer, her presence both grounding and electric. Her voice, soft and low, guided him through each step, her explanations laced with quiet patience. "The colors shift with intention," she said, pointing to a section of the woven thread that glowed faintly gold. "This reflects warmth, openness, your energy." "My energy?" Stephen asked, his brow furrowing. "Yes," she said simply. The threads respond to the weaver. To touch them is to share yourself. Her words sent a shiver through him, the weight of her meaning sinking in. Stephen glanced at the loom, at the delicate threads that shimmered under his touch. He couldn't deny the strange, almost magnetic pull he felt as he worked, the act of weaving grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. As they continued, Stephen became more attuned to the rhythm of the weaving. His initial awkwardness faded, replaced by a quiet focus. Alira's hands occasionally brushed against his as she adjusted the loom, each contact sparking a brief flare of light from her glowing patterns. The bioluminescence had shifted again, now radiating a soft amber hue that seemed to pulse in time with her movements. "You're good at this," Stephen said, breaking the silence. His voice was quieter than he intended, but it felt right in the intimate atmosphere they had created. Alira smiled, her gaze still on the loom. "It is not about skill. It is about intention. You are present, and that is enough." Her words sent another pang through him, a mixture of admiration and something deeper that he couldn't quite name. He watched as her fingers guided the threads with unerring precision, her glowing patterns reflecting the quiet warmth of the moment. For the first time, Stephen felt as though he understood something about her, not just her culture, but the essence of who she was. When they finished, Alira held up the small piece of fabric they had woven together. It was imperfect, the edges uneven, but the colors swirled together in a way that was undeniably beautiful. Stephen stared at it, a strange sense of pride mingling with the weight of the moment. "This is ours," Alira said softly, her glowing patterns shifting into a warm gold. "It is a reflection of us, together." Stephen looked at her, his chest tightening. "It's incredible." Alira's gaze met his, her expression open and unguarded. "It is more than thread, Stephen. It is connection. Trust. Do you feel it?" He nodded, unable to find the words. The silence between them deepened, charged with an intensity that left him breathless. Alira reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his. Her touch was warm, her bioluminescence flaring softly in response. "You understand now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To create, to touch, is to share." Stephen's heart pounded in his chest as he met her gaze. "I think I do." Their eyes lingered, the space between them dissolving into something unspoken yet undeniable. In that moment, Stephen realized that the divide he had once felt between them wasn't a barrier, it was a bridge, and he was ready to cross it. The campus atrium was quiet in the late evening, its artificial starlight casting soft silver shadows across the manicured garden beds. Stephen sat on one of the smooth stone benches, staring up at the glittering display of light above. The air was cool, the faint hum of the climate controls the only sound. Despite the stillness, his mind was anything but calm. Ever since their shared star-weaving session, something between him and Alira had shifted. She had always been warm and open, but now there was a quiet intensity in her presence, an awareness that neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both seemed to feel. Stephen found himself drawn to her in a way that both thrilled and terrified him. He was still lost in thought when he heard the soft rustle of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Alira approaching, her luminous eyes reflecting the starlight above. Her bioluminescent patterns glowed faintly, their colors a blend of deep lavender and gold. She moved with her usual grace, but there was something different about her tonight, something softer, more vulnerable. "You are troubled," she said, her voice calm but tinged with concern. Stephen hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I've just been thinking." Alira tilted her head, the lavender in her patterns deepening slightly. "About what?" Stephen gestured vaguely at the garden, at the stars above. "Everything. You. Us." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than he intended. Alira's glowing patterns shifted, their hues becoming warmer, more golden. She stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You are uncertain," she said quietly. "I can feel it." Stephen sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple, Alira. This isn't something I ever expected, and I don't know what to do with it." Alira sat beside him, her presence impossibly calm. Her bioluminescent patterns pulsed softly, their glow steady and reassuring. "You think too much, Stephen," she said gently. "Feel instead." He looked at her, his chest tightening at the sincerity in her expression. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Alira reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. The warmth of her touch sent a shiver through him, her glowing patterns flaring softly in response. "Start here," she said, her voice steady. "With me." Stephen hesitated, his gaze flicking to their joined hands. Her skin was soft and warm, her bioluminescence shifting to a radiant gold that seemed to listen time with his racing heartbeat. Slowly, tentatively, he turned his hand over, letting his fingers intertwine with hers. The contact was electric, a spark of connection that sent a wave of warmth through him. Alira's glowing patterns flared brighter, their colors deepening into hues of amber and gold. She leaned closer, her presence grounding him even as it set his nerves alight. "In Ilvarian culture," she began, her voice soft and melodic, "touch is not merely physical. It is an exchange, a sharing of presence, of trust, of intention. It is how we say what words cannot." Stephen swallowed hard, his thoughts racing. "And what are you saying now?" Alira's gaze met his, her luminous eyes steady. "That I trust you, that I care for you, that I wish to share more of myself with you." Her words sent a shiver through him, a mix of fear and exhilaration. Stephen knew there was no going back from this moment, no way to pretend he didn't feel the same pull, the same undeniable connection. He exhaled slowly, his voice quiet but resolute. "I think I've been scared of what this means, of how different we are." Alira tilted her head, her glowing patterns pulsing softly. "Difference does not divide us, Stephen. It connects us. It makes what we share unique." Her words settled over him like a balm, easing the tension that had been building in his chest. He turned to her fully, his gaze searching hers. "I want to understand," he said finally. "I want to try. I want to try." Alira's smile was small but genuine, her glowing patterns shifting into hues of soft gold and lavender. She moved closer, her presence enveloping him like a warm embrace. "Then let us begin." She raised her free hand, brushing her fingers lightly against his cheek. The contact was gentle, her touch feather-light but electric. Her bioluminescence flared again, casting a warm glow over his skin. Stephen closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, his breath hitching at the intensity of the moment. Alira's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Feel, Stephen, do not think. Be present with me." Stephen opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. The world around them seemed to fade, the artificial starlight above paling in comparison to the glow of her patterns, the warmth of her touch. Slowly he lifted his own hand, tracing the edge of her jaw with tentative fingers. Her skin was impossibly soft, her glowing patterns flaring brighter at his touch. Their breaths mingled in the quiet space between them, the charged silence filled with unspoken emotions. Alira leaned closer, her forehead resting gently against his. Her bioluminescent patterns pulsed softly, their colors shifting into a radiant gold that seemed to echo the quiet intensity of their connection. In that moment, Stephen felt the weight of their differences dissolve, replaced by something far deeper, a bond that defied explanation, a shared presence that transcended words. They sat together under the artificial starlight, their hands intertwined, their foreheads still touching. The world outside the atrium seemed distant, unimportant. All that mattered was the warmth of her touch, the steady glow of her bioluminescence, the quiet promise that passed between them. For the first time, Stephen felt truly present, no fears, no doubts, just the luminous connection they had built together. And it was more than enough. The sun on the artificial campus horizon painted the sky with hues of orange and lavender, but Stephen barely noticed. He stood in the dorm room, staring at the small piece of starwoven fabric he and Alira had created days earlier. It shimmered in the dim light, the threads shifting between deep gold and soft blue as if alive with memory. His fingers brushed over its surface, and he could still feel the echoes of that night, in the atrium, the warmth of her hand, the quiet pulse of her bioluminescence. Behind him, the door slid open with a soft hiss. He didn't need to turn around to know it was her. The air always seemed to hum faintly in her presence, her energy palpable even before she spoke. "You are quiet," Alira said, her voice melodic, as she crossed the room with her usual grace. Her glowing patterns were soft and muted, their lavender hues mingling with gold as she approached him. "Are you worried?" Stephen hesitated before answering, still staring at the fabric in his hand. "Not worried. Just thinking." Alira tilted her head, her luminous eyes studying him with quiet intensity. "You think too much," she said gently, stepping closer. "Your mind circles, but your heart knows the truth." Stephen turned to face her, and the sight of her stole his breath. She was dressed in a flowing Ilvarian garment, its fabric shimmering faintly like liquid starlight. The patterns on her skin were brighter now, shifting like constellations caught in motion, a testament to her emotions calm yet charged, steady yet expectant. "Sometimes it's hard to trust what you feel," Stephen admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Especially when it's something this big." Alira's glowing patterns deepened in hue, her expression softening. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his hand. "What we share is not small, Stephen," she said, "but it is not something to fear." Her touch sent a wave of warmth through him, grounding and electrifying all at once. He looked down at their joined hands, at the way her bioluminescence flared softly in response to his touch. "When I just don't want to mess this up," he said. "You're so different. I'm still figuring out how to be in your world." Alira stepped closer, her presence wrapping around him like a cocoon. "Stephen," she said, her voice low and steady, "it is not about entering my world or leaving yours. It is about what we create together. A shared horizon." Her words settled over him like a balm, easing the tension that had been building in his chest. He met her gaze, and for the first time he allowed himself to fully accept what he felt: the connection, the trust, the quiet intensity that bound them together. "I want that," he said, his voice resolute. "I want to build something with you." Later that evening, they ventured back to the campus atrium, drawn by the quiet serenity of its artificial starlight. The garden paths were deserted, the faint scent of flowers lingering in the cool air. Alira led him to a secluded corner where the light seemed softer, the shadows deeper. She knelt on the smooth grass, gesturing for him to join her. "I want to show you something," she said as she opened a small pouch she had brought with her. Inside were more of the shimmering threads, their colors shifting like liquid light. Stephen knelt beside her, his curiosity piqued. "What is this?" he asked. "A continuation," she replied, her voice steady. "A new weaving, this time a pattern of intention, a bond." Stephen's heart raced at the weight of her words. "A bond?" Alira nodded, her glowing pattern shifting to a deep, resonant gold. In Ovarian culture, to weave a bond is to commit to shared growth, shared trust. It is not something taken lightly. He swallowed hard, the enormity of her gesture sinking in. "And you want to do this with me?" She turned to him, her expression open and unguarded. "I do, if you are willing." Stephen hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I am." The weaving was unlike anything he had experienced before. Alira guided him through each movement, her hands occasionally brushing against his as they worked. The threads shimmered under their combined touch, their colors deepening and intertwining in ways that felt almost alive. Stephen felt as though he were weaving more than fabric, he was weaving a connection, a shared promise that stretched beyond words. As they worked, Alira spoke softly, her voice a steady thread in the quiet. She explained the significance of each color, each pattern, her bioluminescent patterns mirroring the shifting threads. Stephen listened, his focus split between her words and the warmth of her presence. When they finished, Alira held up the completed piece. It was small but breathtaking, the threads forming an intricate pattern that seemed to glow with its own inner light. She turned to him, her gaze steady. "This is us," she said simply. "Our bond." Stephen reached out, his fingers brushing against the fabric. He could feel the weight of her trust, her intention, her care woven into every thread. "It's incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Alira smiled, her glowing patterns flaring briefly. "As are you." As the night deepened, they sat side by side under the artificial starlight, their bond woven and their connection solidified. Stephen reached out, his hand finding hers, and their fingers intertwined. Her glowing patterns responded instantly, their hues shifting to a radiant gold that mirrored the warmth in his chest. For the first time, Stephen felt no hesitation, no fear. He leaned closer, his forehead resting lightly against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet space between them. Alira's bioluminescence pulsed softly, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the beat of his heart. In that moment, there were no questions, no doubts, only the luminous horizon they had created together, stretching endlessly before them.